Hi, I'm Jeanette Sutherland and welcome to Nature Connects, episode 6, titled Beavers and Butterflies. In this special 2-part episode, we journey beyond the upper catchments of the Tamar into the heart of West Devon. We then take ourselves back to the Tamar Valley to Luckett, exploring 2 remarkable species that are helping us shape our landscapes and inspire nature recovery efforts across the region. In part 1, we begin at a Devon Wildlife Trust Beaver enclosure, where we're joined by Matt Holden, the Devon Wildlife Trust's Beaver project lead, and Mark Elliott, an ecological consultant with a wealth of experience in beaver reintroduction and management. Together we explore what it means to be beaver ready as wild populations begin to return to our river catchments. We discuss the biodiversity and climate resilience benefits of beaver activity, the lessons learned from the Devon trial, and how these insights have influenced national policy. Along the way, we unpack common myths, shifting public perceptions, and how beavers can help us reconnect with the wild rhythms of nature. In part 2, we head back to the Tamar Valley, visiting Greenscombe Woods, a Duchy of Cornwall site, where we meet Jenny Plackett from Butterfly Conservation. This beautiful woodland is home to the Heath Fritillary, one of the UK's rarest butterflies and a flagship species in the Tamar Valley National Landscape Recovery Plan. Jenny shares the conservation story of this delicate species, the habitat work that supports it, and how citizen science through the Big Butterfly Count is helping monitor and protect butterfly populations. We also explore how butterflies can spark a deeper connection to nature and how local communities are playing a vital role in their recovery. From the engineering marvels of beavers to the fleeting beauty of butterflies, this 2-part episode celebrates the power of nature to restore, inspire, and connect us all. I'm really excited to be here at the Devon Beaver Project site near Oakhampton with Matt Holden from DWT and Mark Elliott to talk all things beavers. So Matt, if you could start off just telling us a bit about the site, the project, what is the history and the journey?
Yeah, of course. So this site has been here since 2010, so it's probably one of the longest standing beaver enclosures in England. As time's gone on, beavers have transformed this site. So it was a culm grassland, which had heavily scrubbed over in 2010. And really the reintroduction of beavers here was as a management tool to explore how beavers might play a role in managing the scrub on this wet grassland site. And as we walk down the site and as we talk you through it, Jeanette, you'll see that beavers have transformed this landscape. There's probably 13 plus ponds as you go down through this small watercourse. They've knocked down trees, they've coppiced them. You've got lots of different dynamic processes taking place as water flows through the site. And it's fantastic. Every time I come here, it looks different. So, Mark, your involvement in this site?
Yeah, so I worked at DWT in 2010 when we built the fence. And it's really hard to remember just how different it was. But standing here, we can see the sky nice and clearly. But back in 2010, you would almost feel like you were in a woodland. It was a quite tall willow scrub, sort of 10, 15 foot tall. And it's now completely transformed into an open grassland. And I think the other thing to say is that we're on a tiny stream here. This watercourse starts in that field there, so we're right at the very, very headwaters, and it's not flowing at the moment, as you can see. We do get a spring that feeds it when there's a bit of rain, so we get a little bit of water coming in here most of the time, but we're right up in the very headwaters, and it's in these areas that the transformation that beavers have by building their dams in these little streams, storing water and then gradually releasing it. It's just incredible.
So when the project started, did there have to be some initial intervention put in to get the beavers started?
Well, other than building the fence and making sure the fence was really solid and beaver proof, which is quite a challenge, but that's what we did. We did also build a release pond just to give them some initial security and an artificial lodge to release them into. But other than that, we really didn't do anything else at all. We left the beavers to it.
Yeah. So they've now been here for 15 years. So how have you seen that changed?
I think it's ever evolving. There's been some fantastic research at this site, so we've collaborated with the University of Exeter throughout the whole period of time in which the site's been here. That's slowed slightly recently, but some of the formative understanding of what beavers could do in England has come from that research. So around hydrology, Mark mentioned some of the first information about how beavers can slow the flow of water and potentially reduce flood peak flows came from this site. Changes to water quality, reducing downstream sediment and nitrate and phosphate came from this site, as well as some of the ecological research. So when Mark left DWT in 2022, his parting gift to us was this lovely ecology report which summarises all of the changes that's happened on this site in the period of time. And it's been fascinating from a species perspective. We've seen really exponential rises in amphibians, huge increases in the diversity of water beetles, same with dragonflies and damselflies, and with bird species too. So it's really breathed life back into this site. And in terms of transformation, it's ever evolving for sure. Yeah.
And I guess that also goes beyond the fence, that increase in biodiversity is then a ripple effect out into the wider landscape.
Absolutely.
Yeah, fantastic. So, can you tell us a bit more about the part the beaver plays in natural flood management and drought resilience?
I totally can, but I think seeing's believing. So shall we walk down to one of the dams and we can talk through it at the wetlands site?
Sounds like a plan. Let's go. So, Matt, and we've walked through some very wet long grass. I could see along the way some canal activity, and we've just stood talking about what we can see in the landscape. So we've come to one of the ponds. So could you just tell us now a bit more about what we're seeing, what and why we think it's going on?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've just walked downstream, and in amongst the undergrowth there's probably been, 10 dams down through that landscape and across the valley bottom. It's quite a small valley bottom, probably this dam is 15 metres long. But what we're looking at now is quite a large beaver dam, which is made up of mud, sticks and stones. And as you can see, it's become very vegetated. It almost looks like a permanent structure. And if you cast your mind back 400-500 years, or you take yourself off to parts of continental Europe, this is what our headwaters really would have looked like. So there would have been these series of terrace ponds, channels that seep around the outside during high flow events, and really abundant with life. We've got this overhanging willow that's providing forage for beavers and a bit of shade, and all of this is fantastic habitat for things like amphibians and like. In terms of natural flood management, what we found from the research is that as water goes straight down a catchment, in our typical or traditionally managed catchments, it goes down very fast. We've straightened or canalised sections of river that make water that goes from A to B extremely fast. And if that all hits villages at the same time, we get flooding and issues associated with that. So we know our water system is broken in effect. Now, what beavers tend to do, or even humans are doing now as part of natural flood management projects, is trying to slow down the flow of water and hold more of it in the upper catchment. And what the research from the University of Exeter in the UK has shown across multiple beaver sites, I should add, is that as water goes down through these series of dams and it's pushed out laterally into the floodplain, into all this surface roughness, the water going downstream goes much slower. And they've seen reductions in flood peak flows by up to 60%, and on average reductions of 30%. And when you're talking with kind of people who are interested in flooding, that's really significant reductions in flood peak flows.
Yeah, and how about then on the other end of the spectrum, we've just had a really dry spring, of the benefits of the beaver when we're having those times of no rain.
Yeah, absolutely. So just as our A to B system, super speedy straight line channels zoom things out to sea, we lose water from our landscapes very quickly. And what we see is with these kind of leaky, porous, sponge-like systems is they hold water in the headwaters and reduce that more slowly. Now, I will add that the research around that is still being developed. It's less well understood than the management aspects and the reductions in flood peak flows. But at this site in particular, we saw elevated base flows going out of the site compared to coming into the site. And obviously you saw at the top, didn't you, that it was dry coming in. But in this lower part, we've got water held within the landscape. And that's really important, that it can allow it to release slowly and support downstream water supply.
So Mark, as we've walked down, we've all been chatting and discussing about visually what we are seeing within the landscape. And for me, I can see just a wealth of flora at all different levels, up to the tree canopy and the birds and the butterflies. But to the untrained eye, it'd just be great to talk to our listeners about what the landscape is looking like, but how we need to retrain our thoughts on that idealised view.
I think it's a good example of, I guess it's what a landscape would have looked like. 400 or 500 years ago, we've tamed our landscape so much. We like tidiness. We've straightened our watercourses. We imagine our watercourses to be these single channels, and they really weren't in the past. And so this just gives you a little bit of a window into what the landscape would have looked like before it had been so heavily engineered. And it's messy. It's untidy. We've got dead wood. We've actually got standing dead wood in places. And that's so important ecologically, and also for just returning the carbon and the nutrients back into the soil for future generations of trees to use up. So, we're so good at tidying everything up. And what beavers do is just create a little bit more chaos and a little bit more mess. And ecologically, that's just so important.
Yeah. So for us and for our listeners, it is all about just allowing there to be a bit more chaos from nature, because that's what it wants.
Giving it a bit of space and just going a little bit less intensive with the tidying up, with the manicuring and the engineering.
Yeah. And I loved what you said, Matt, about the life of a tree. It has so many stages and so many benefits throughout its life, and it is as beneficial as a standing deadwood as it is as a living, thriving.
Yeah, we often see trees, don't we, as this emblem of conservation, and that planting a tree is like the act of conservation. It's so important. We need a more wooded landscape. I fully support that. And I understand people's concerns. Beavers are completely herbivorous, especially during the winter. They will be gnawing on trees. We've seen some reasonably sized willow and birch, haven't we, that have been gnawed by beaver. But in doing that, they either drop the tree and then it changes position, as one landowner put it to me, or they ring bark the trees sometimes. And that can be really frustrating if that's a tree you really like. We understand that. But that allows this dead tree to come into a new phase of its life, for want of a better term, as it recedes. And that deadwood's really important for certain species that we've lost in England. So you think about shrikes or some of the woodpecker species. So some of those things are really critical for our ecosystems, and we just don't have enough of them. So it's brilliant to see them in a landscape like this.
So we've just spoken about the beaver as a native species. So let's rewind just a little, and for those people listening who may not know much or anything at all about the beaver, Mark, if you could just give us a beaver lowdown.
Yeah, they are a big animal. I think the first time people see them, the first reaction is often one of surprise about how large they are. So we're talking about a rodent that's about 1 metre in length, and an adult might be something like 25 kilograms in weight. So we're talking about a really big animal. Semi-aquatic, so they really do live in and close to water. They have these underwater burrow entrances, which are really important for their ecology. And actually that's why they build these dams in the headwaters, because we haven't got the depth of water. And so they want to be able to create that water so that they can have these underwater burrow entrances. They're entirely vegetarian, so they don't eat fish. In the summer months, they just feed on any sort of soft vegetation. You can see around us, we've got all this lush growth. This is all food for beavers. And then in the winter, when things die back and gets a bit harder for them, that's when they tend to go for the more woody stuff. So they'll be stripping the bark off willow trees, and they'll be felling trees to reach the upper branches and then feeding on those. So they're a giant vegetarian rodent.
We've talked about the site, we've talked about the ecology and the benefits. So it'd be great now to step out into the wider context and landscape of the beaver. Now we know with policy and law changing in wild releases, so living with beavers, and as a society, as a landscape, are we beaver ready?
Yeah, brilliant. I'll just set the scene. So we're in a fenced enclosure here where beavers are contained within a fence, but elsewhere in Devon, as you know, we have beavers living in the wild, and we have had some for some time. There's a really good stronghold of beaver populations in the River Otter. There's a small population in the River Exe, in the Tor, and also a developing population in the Tamar. And they've been known to be in the Tamar for some time by people, by local communities. But it wasn't until we started to get more involved with the local community in the Tamar in 2019 that we set up the Tamar Beaver Management Group. I say we, Mark set that out, so I'll let him go into that. But now in the Tamar, we think we've probably got over 30 beaver territories. So they're scattered throughout the catchment, down from Calstock right up to the upper River Otter. And you asked about, are we beaver ready? And it's an interesting concept, really, because interestingly in the Tamar there's an awful lot of really good, what we call riparian, and what we mean by that is riverside, that corridor next to the river, really good riparian habitat. And when I say a lot, we've got about 940 kilometres of that throughout the Tamar catchment. So what's interesting about the Tamar compared to some of those other rivers I mentioned is probably more beaver ready, if you like, than other catchments. And what I mean by that is there's these lovely pockets and extents of riparian wooded zones, often wet marshy areas next to the river, that provide really good habitat for beavers. So I think there's a lot for us still to learn and to communicate, but we're certainly on the journey to being more beaver ready in the Tamar catchment. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Mark.
Yeah, I think it is all about the space that we give our watercourses, because the thing about beavers is that they have very limited impacts in terms of where they're building dams and where they're flooding areas of land. It's in very predictable, very narrow corridors alongside the watercourses. And so by just taking our development and our agriculture out of those narrow corridors, out of those floodplains, it just allows the beavers to be able to behave more naturally, create these huge benefits as well in terms of flood relief and that sort of thing, but without bringing them into conflict.
Yeah.
And so that's where beaver readiness really comes in, is if you can just somehow provide a little bit more space for watercourses, then beavers can then reintegrate back into the landscape without really causing any problems at all.
Yeah.
And what I'll add there is one of the ways that we're trying to make the catchment more beaver ready is to work with stakeholders, work with communities, work with the Environment Agency, Natural England, people like yourselves at the National Landscape, both to make communities aware of what beavers are, what they do, but also to try and support landowners either with practical challenges or to make space. We've got this Making Space for Water programme in effect that is working towards trying to provide funding so that space can be made, because we totally understand that in places it's a transition or a change in what you've been doing already.
Yeah, and listening to you both speak, we can see the huge wealth of benefit, but there are challenges. I know from talking with people within the community, concerns about management. Obviously, we don't have apex predators, so how are they going to be managed? What is the plan moving forward for that mitigation and challenge?
Yeah. So I'll just explain a bit on where we're at in the beaver recovery journey, because it all feels really new to us in Britain. We started this journey here with a fenced enclosure in 2010, and that kind of around the same time that the Scottish beaver trial started. But beavers have been recovered across parts of Europe since the beginning of the 1900s, and the same in the United States. Because when the population was really at its lowest, it's probably about 1,200 individuals in these 4 remnant pockets in Europe. And I should add that the species we have in Europe is a different species to that's in North America. So we're in this kind of journey, if you like, in recovering a species back to its once native range, and they've made really leaps and bounds on that in Europe. And the reason I mention that is there's so much we could learn from our counterparts on the continent around living alongside beavers, around some of the challenges, around some of the opportunities. Interestingly, the Netherlands, for example, have got 6,000 beavers, and the first beavers were introduced by the King and Queen. So it's interesting how different countries have gone about this. But yeah, we recognise that when you have an eco-engineer back in a landscape full of very kind of man-made structures and human engineers, there's going to be some challenges that we face. So that's one of the things we've done really consistently throughout the Devon Beaver projects, is to work with landowners, work with communities, work with the councils to provide the right kind of information and guidance that they might need to try and live alongside and work with beavers and to mitigate some of the challenges.
And I guess we could add in now that people listening to this, we will put in the show notes all the places that they can get further information from Devon Wildlife Trust, the Beaver Trust, of those wider projects, just to support knowledge and education.
Absolutely, and I should add that in the Tamar, we've got this Tamar Beaver Management Group. We've got one in East Devon as well, and in the other populations in England. And through that, we are able to offer visits and advice and guidance. We're working very closely with Mark on that. So Mark's delivering freelance advice and guidance through the Beaver Management Group. So if people do want to get in touch and do want support, then please do reach out.
So, Mark, if you could elaborate a bit more for us on what that beaver management support, stakeholder engagement, how that is actually looking on the ground on a day-to-day basis.
We get quite a lot of contacts from landowners and others where there's beavers moving into areas within the Tamar catchment. And actually, in the vast majority of cases, landowners are really quite welcoming and actually say, look, we're really pleased that the beavers are here, but we don't want you to tell anybody about them. They want to keep their sites quiet. And I think that does reflect the wider support in the community. The surveys that were carried out during the River Otter trial suggested that we've got about 85 to 90% support in the wider community for beaver introduction. But there are definitely groups, certainly within the landowning and the fisheries communities, that are a bit more split, and it's become a bit polarised in places in those sectors. But generally, there's really good support. And actually what's really interesting is that when people do first have beavers turning up on their land, it's actually more questions than anything else. Because we're not familiar with this animal really and what it's going to do, there's a lot of myths around beavers. Do they eat fish, and are they going to fell all my trees, and all those sort of questions that people have. And people really, once they understand what beavers are going to do and what they might do, they do generally relax. Now, there are going to be some places where it's harder to deal with beaver management in very flat landscapes, particularly in lower floodplains where you can have some more issues. So just providing people with support has just been, I think, the most important thing, so that people don't feel like they're dealing with this new animal on their own.
Yeah. So are you able to give an example of where there has been maybe significant challenge or concern of how that is then managed?
In about 20% of the territories in the Tamar, we protect trees. So that might be apple trees that have been planted close to the rivers. And so we've got beavers moving into a territory, and they do like apples. They like feeding on apples, they feed on windfall apples, and they will also take apple trees that are close to water. So we often just protect those trees. We put a ring of weld mesh around the trunk of the tree, and it's perfectly adequate to just discourage the beavers from feeding on it. Now, in a very small proportion of cases, we have to remove dams where they're causing an issue with agriculture particularly. So again, it's 15% of sites that have some degree of dam management, but even that might be very one-off, very minor. The only downside that it can cause is a little bit of conflict between neighbours. So you often get landowners that are very welcoming, but the dams that are being built by the beavers might then impact on somebody upstream, and they're not so welcoming. And so you then sometimes have to act as a bit of a go-between to try and resolve a little bit of conflict there. But generally, it's actually it's a really nice story. The number of people that are so welcoming of having this animal back has been really lovely to see.
So could you just brief us on the law and legislation as far as dam removal and how that is done? Obviously, there is a protocol that needs to be followed.
Yeah, of course. So beavers are now a European protected species in England, as they are in Scotland and as they are in the majority of their range in Europe. And that has legislation around it. But most of the licensing and management guidance around beavers is extremely pragmatic. And Natural England have led to listen to people like ourselves and through our forums and work with farmers and landowners, fisheries groups, all the rest, to try and provide a really pragmatic licence structure. So there's plenty of work that you can do to manage beaver activity without a licence. So that includes protecting trees, managing dams that are under 2 weeks old is another example. So if something turns up in a place which is really intolerable, I'll use an example from the River Otter catchment where beavers have built a dam on a seasonal basis, not permanently, but on a seasonal basis just below a road culvert, and that has flooded the road. So that gets removed straight away. That's a zero tolerance dam, and that can be removed by the landowner, removed by ourselves, removed by the highways guys within that two-week rule. There's a few other things as well, and it's all laid out on the government website. But if you're going to take higher impact activity on, or you're going to manage dams that are well established or older, then you need to think about getting a licence. And Natural England provide training for free to obtain those licences. So you have a series of 3 licences. One's quite straightforward to get, allows you to manage beavers through the winter. And there's another that allows you to manage them through the year. And then there's a 3rd licence. And when I say manage beaver, I mean that in the broadest sense. What I mean is managing activities related to beavers. So you need to justify that. It's not like we can just go around pulling out dams anywhere or wrapping trees. It needs to be in fitting with the kind of a hierarchy of needs of the licence and the likes. But the idea is that it's not tying people in knots. If they need to manage their land for a particular use and beavers that are challenging that, then obviously we'd always try and work with them to make space. But if that's not something they feel is tenable, then there's a process to follow.
Can we also just touch on when we're thinking about dams? So I'm thinking about down in Tamar Valley and the river catchment. Our last podcast was on fish migration and the concerns about the damming and what is the science and the research telling us about that impact or support for fish migration.
There is an understanding that beavers and obviously these migratory fish species like Atlantic salmon, brown and sea trout will have co-evolved together for millennia. Now that we're in a different situation now, we recognise that, and that the stocks of these species, often because of a huge range of factors, are lower or threatened. But beavers obviously create habitat in certain ways that could provide incredible benefits for fish species, not just salmonids, but coarse fish species as well. You can see the ponded habitats behind us present both. There's loads of stuff to eat in here. There's loads of refuge in here, both thermal and from outside predation. So there's a really well-studied suite of benefits that could align with the recovery of some of these species.
I think the biggest concern that people have is to do with migration of particularly salmon and sea trout, and they're very different fish, and they're migrating upstream into slightly different areas in order to spawn, and then the smolts will then migrate back down again to sea. And I think there is a perception, partly because we have littered our watercourses with weirs and man-made obstacles, and we are actively taking them out because we understand the effect they're having on migrating fish. So I think there's a little bit of a perception that beaver dams are going to be in any way similar, and they're really not. Firstly, they're much more in the headwaters, so we don't see beavers building dams in the main rivers towards the bottom of the rivers at all. We just don't. That's just not the way they behave. And obviously, so if you've got all of the big fish like the salmon and the sea trout coming upstream, they're really not coming across these beaver dams in the lower parts of the catchment at all. But what you do get is up in these real headwater streams, you do get dams built that are often temporary structures. They come and go, they get washed out by floods, and particularly in these sort of middle reaches, we're talking about streams that are maybe 3 or 4 metres across, and this is the area where mostly it's the sea trout that are spawning, and they are looking for these complex habitats. They're looking for these fresh gravel beds and riffles that are in the channel. And actually, as these beaver dams come and go in these reaches, it creates these clean gravel beds. So it's been really interesting to see how these new fish habitats and the complexity that these different fish species need, how they're created by these dynamic beaver dams. So the science is still fairly embryonic, but I mean, all the evidence from elsewhere in the world where beavers and fish are living alongside each other is that generally beavers are creating real opportunities for these fish species. And so I think that the issue with migration is really not going to be a significant one.
I think to come in, so with that in mind, and as Mark alluded to, there's this huge swathe of research that's happened in North America and in Europe as well around this. And there is a concern that concrete dam looks like a sticks and mud dam, and as you can see, Jeanette, it's a really different structure. And one of the things that we've been doing is working with the Beaver Trust, the Atlantic Salmon Trust, Wild Trout Trust and West Country Rivers Trust to develop this thing called the Beaver Dam Assessment Pack. And that is really to provide both sides of the conversation, both us as beaver ecologists and people who are fisheries ecologists or are anglers, with the information around the two different species and how they behave and how they act, so that we can understand this story better. But it's a really practical tool that it's due to be published in summer this year, that looks at how can we assess beaver dams in such a way that gives us information about its likely implications for Atlantic salmon or for sea trout. And by implications I mean both positive or negative. And obviously there's these two things, there's upstream migration of the adult fish and then these downstream smolt migration. So we're looking at both those facets of the equation. And what I think is really fascinating and really good about this tool is that it will open up the conversation, allow us to look at real life case-by-case examples of, is this likely to be a barrier for fish now? If it is there any mitigation management techniques that we can use? And can we let that dam develop? Can we let it spread out across the floodplain? Can we allow it to develop this anastomosed, complex braided channel system which will allow fish to pass up through it? Because I should add, that's exactly what they've looked at in North America, and parts of, it's called the BRAT tool. We call it a beaver dam capacity model, right, to understand where beavers will build dams. But the BRAT tool was the beaver restoration assessment tool. And that was very much looking to reinforce beaver populations in places where they wanted to restore fish habitat. So different species of salmon, granted, but really looking at the same kind of migratory movements, creating these pools, these dynamic, complex river systems. So I think that there's a whole lot of nuance to the whole thing. And I think what we understand is that, yes, looking at a certain dam at a certain period in time might allow you to come to the same assessment that it looks a bit like a concrete dam and is a barrier to a fish. But if you look at that dam during December, January, February, it might be a whole different picture. So we're just trying to build that into the conversation really about this. And it's been fantastic actually working with organisations on the Tamar. So some of the guys in the fisheries organisations and the fishing clubs have been really good at sharing their knowledge, their concerns, and also their positive stories around how they feel beavers and fish could live together again, really in harmony.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the collaboration of the organisations and also the collaboration of nature. So I know from a more personal experience, knowing that there are beavers in the landscape where I live on a catchment to the Tamar, just that excitement and awe and wonder of knowing that we have beavers. So I'd be really interested to hear some of your recollections and experiences of the communities that you are working with who are also experiencing that excitement of the beaver being back.
Talking at a more commercial level, I mean, it's interesting seeing how the River Otter in particular, where there's quite a lot of public access where beavers are, has become really a hotbed for visitors around beavers. And there's 3 tour companies doing wildlife tours there now, and we do community walks every year. But I always obviously get asked by my mates or family friends, you know, we take us out. And I think it's really affirming because it is a wonderful experience to take, especially young people who are interested in nature, out into the countryside. I mean, it's incredible how many dinosaurs a 7-year-old know, but it's also incredible how much actually they know about wildlife. And I was out recently with some friends who come down to visit, and Lewis, who's 7, really wanted to see beavers. And we went off down the River Otter, and then we were looking for beavers, and we got a really good view of a female early in the season. And then we went off and we went back to join them later. Apparently in the car, Lewis had said, "That was the best day of my life so far." And I thought that was just lovely, you know, like, I was just like, that's so nice, you know, because we're just wrapped up in it from the day to day.
Yeah.
So I think they are an incredible species and they do captivate people, and they're fascinating in how they behave and they're fascinating in how they function.
My daughter was the same. She would have been about the same age, so she would have been about 6 or 7, and we were beaver watching on the River Otter one night, and I think it's probably the same female who was just such a good ambassador for beavers. She really was. And she came out of the water. We were just standing on the bank. This beaver came out of the water probably 2 metres from us. She came out, she grabbed a piece of willow, she cut this piece of willow, which was about 1 inch in diameter, in 2 bites. So just giving you an indication of just how powerful those teeth are. And then she slipped back into the water. And we just looked at each other, we just couldn't believe it. She's 14 now and she still remembers that moment.
So just hearing those more personal stories of the impact of beavers having on people personally, and I think it is so important that our younger generations are being drawn in and having that understanding and that excitement to take with them on this amazing journey that you've shared with us today is absolutely vital. So now looking forward, I feel the future for beavers is so bright and so promising. So if you could just build on that, on what the future is for the beavers in the UK.
I think it really is bright, and I mean, so in February 2025 this year, we had the announcement from government that welcomed stakeholder groups or organisations like ourselves to apply for an expression of interest, say, into wild release of beavers, and really opened up this idea of we could recover this species more broadly than just the strongholds, which are really Devon and Kent. So this gives a bit of a future look from government around what they're going to do in terms of recovering beavers across the country. I guess the priority for us at Devon Wildlife Trust is that we do this right, that we make sure that where we've had small founding populations, we consider the genetics of those populations, and where we need to, we address that. We want to have a healthy, genetically diverse and thriving beaver population in Devon, and that needs to be looked at. So that's a real priority for us, but really positive news earlier this year and really positive outlook for beavers in their recovery journey.
So as we finish this wonderful experience of being here in the enclosure, I would just be really interested to hear from both of you, working so closely with beavers and witnessing their impact on the landscape. How has your own connection with nature deepened or changed? And developing on from how it has impacted you, how do you feel that beavers can help others to reconnect with nature when we know that we're at a time in society when perhaps we're more disconnected from nature than ever?
I think back to the early days of when we first put beavers into this enclosure. I'm a wetland ecologist, and ever since I was a kid I was interested in frogs and fish and stuff, and so I've been involved with creating wetlands and building ponds, using machines, etc. And then when we first started to see what beavers did in here, it totally blew my mind. Just this realisation that you had got this proper ecosystem engineer suddenly doing this remarkable pond creation, that we could never do this with machines and with contractors. It would just be impossible to get the subtleties, and it was just remarkable. And what's really nice is now seeing over the last 5 years other organisations and other individuals that have been putting beavers into enclosures and watching them go through that process of realisation as well, of just how remarkable and how powerful this ecosystem engineer is. So, and that has really, there's something about working with beavers that just gives you real sort of positivity, I think, about the sort of resilience of having this animal back. It means that almost whatever we do as humans and whatever the future of humans is, beavers being back here, they will restore these ecosystems.
Yeah, amazing.
Yeah, I think it's a vision of hope, isn't it? I think the really nice thing is, to use an example, we have been talking about a project to try and create habitat for beavers and to reduce downstream flooding at 3 flood-prone communities in the River Otter catchment. And we had all these lovely ideas, and it took a year before this project started. At the beginning of that year, we said on the map, this is where we'd really love beavers to be. We've got support from the landowners. These could be really good sites. What we need is to get the money first. As we went through that process for the year, we got a few reports. And we said, well, we haven't started the project yet. They said, well, beavers have turned up already. So at 2 of those sites where we'd earmarked and thought this would be a good place for beavers, they could build dams, they could slow the flow of water, they could help build resilience in these catchments, they create loads of cool habitats. They just turned up and did it. And that was without us getting the money.
For free.
For free. So there is a cost to having wildlife, especially eco-engineers, back in the landscape. But it's really important that we see what these animals can do. And I think, like Mark said, they just give you this real sense of, if we just step away a little bit, it's not that we need to intervene, we don't need to get the chainsaw out, we don't need to tidy this up, we don't need to dig a pond here. we just step away a little bit, they will do it for us. And I think once you see what they do, you've got a lot of trust and a lot of faith that they'll do it well.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I think that's just the perfect way to end this morning, is trust, faith and hope in nature, and let it do its things. And for us to sit back and enjoy and absorb and learn from that. Amazing. Well, thank you, both of you, for your time this morning, to bringing me here, to show me this amazing habitat and ecosystem. I've learnt lots again, which is why I love doing this. Yeah, thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure.
So as we prepare to leave the beaver enclosure, I feel it's a perfect opportunity just to take that time to stop and reflect. Reflect on the changes in this landscape, the dynamic elements of this changing habitat that one creature, the beaver, has created, yet making a home for an abundance of wildlife. It's thriving, it's green. It's so important that we just take that time to look, to think, to consider. So if you can, take a moment or two to pause, engage and connect.